Yo, 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 what's up, fam? We are back. It's Actuali Podcast and our special series covering John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Welcome back to Meaning Making 101. On Actuali, we are live on Twitch. We are live on YouTube. What's up, Twitch fam? What's up, YouTube fam? And going live on Facebook now.
Hey.
What's up, Facebook fam? Actualize in the house. It's Meaning Making 101. We are continuing our coverage of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis lecture series. Now, we are up to episode 41. What is rationality?
What is rationality?
That's
If
a
it
good
cannot be
question.
reduced to logic, what is it?
What is it?
And that's some of what we talked about in last week's episode.
That's it, actually. And we're going to do a quick recap here. We're going to get us shared up on all the places. Go ahead, Mr.
So
DJ.
while he's sharing up, we early on we defined wisdom, which is systematic seeing through illusion into reality, a fundamental systematic insight. So we talked about systematic errors in the beginning, and we gave the example of hold on, let me make sure I'm there. Yeah, okay. So we gave the example of the the kids where you have a volume of water, and then you pour it into one thing, and then you pour the same volume into another thing that's shaped a different way, and the kid, when you ask which has more, even though they know that it's the same amount of volume, they'll pick whichever one where the water level rises the highest. So tall, skinny looks like more. And actually, interestingly enough, they do that to you at, whatever the big chain sit-down restaurants like Ruby Tuesdays and stuff, where they have like the extra large beer, and it's in this big, tall-looking glass. But the way the glass is designed, you only get a few more ounces of beer.
Looks bigger than it actually is.
So kids much like adults go through a process of assimilation and accommodation and eventually see through their errors. And the reason why we call it systematic errors is because it's errors through the whole system. And the error that the kids are having right now is that even though they know that there's the same amount of volume being put into both of them, the way their brains are understanding the world is taller means more, right? But eventually you grow, and you have a systematic insight or a sensibility insight, and you see past your errors. And the phrase "a child is to the adult as the adult is to the sage" came up. So that's basically the example. You grow, and now that we're adults, the next is to free ourselves of those systematic errors and grow into the sage, which cognitively speaking would be the next step. It's why sages are usually depicted as old folk. It takes a while. So the core feature of to be wise is automatically related to insight. There's two guys, Ian and Barber. What I have here is wisdom is not what you know, but how you know. So knowing more about or focusing more on the process than the product. So rationality is the focus on the process and the product, but not neglecting the process for the focus on the product. So there's our types of knowing, like how you know. There is the descriptive, which are the facts, grasping the facts. And then the interpretive, the process, interpreting the process, understanding, grasping the significance of what you know. So one is the facts, and then the next is so the facts would be descriptive, and the next would be interpretive, which is the significance. You're interpreting the significance of a set of data. Say, okay, you can have all the data, all the facts and everything, and you're still left with no understanding of it. So, and then there's a third, which is the perspectival participatory knowing. It's and pragmatic self-contradiction. And he gave an example for pragmatic self-contradiction is not the statement, but the identity with making of the statement. So he said, "I am asleep," but the "I" and the "I am asleep" is coming from the perspective of an awake person. So there's that contradiction, a
So
pragmatic
it's a pragmatic self-contradiction.
Yes, because you must be awake to make that statement, but you're talking about,
Yeah, you're participating in the act of being awake while you're saying this statement. I'm asleep.
yeah.
So it's a pragmatic
And
self-contradiction.
I am wise.
It's another.
Is another.
It's an indication that one is taking on the identity of being wise.
Yeah,
Yeah.
opposed to the process of it.
Just basically admitting that I only know what I don't know.
Yeah,
And being willing to admit that. So and then let me do a quick just backtrack because you were talking about how wisdom is the seeing through of illusion. It's the systematic seeing through of illusion and into reality. And we're understanding now in this episode the relation between wisdom and rationality in episode 41 that we are now reviewing. Or I'm sorry, episode 40. We're on to episode 41 today. So, and, the systematic seeing through is seeing through the whole family, the whole set of problems.
Yeah.
And we have to constantly be optimizing these systems of constraints that we have built in.
Yeah, and then when it comes to the systematic errors, we do have a set of errors that we make in total that are not just one type of error, but over the entire system.
It's broad. It's not just in one generalized domain. It's across several systems or several domains that are interrelated. And it's like the opposite of when we have an insight. When we have like a cascade of insights, we're in the flow state. This is the opposite of that, to where you're having
a cascade of
errors. Yeah, of errors in how you're framing whatever you're looking at in reality. So wisdom is how I am knowing rather than what I am knowing, and that's how we start getting into the understanding of.
And that's also a
descriptive, interpretive knowledge.
The confusion is also a modal confusion as well between the having and the being mode.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. So we get confused about what kind of mode of being I am in. So that's modal confusion. What mode of being are you? Are you in a having mode or are you in a being mode? Yeah. And when we're in the having mode, we're looking for things like food, shelter, survival necessities. But so much in our life, when we could just be relaxed in our being mode, we are utilizing our having mode to try and achieve being needs. So needs of belonging, needs of friendship and love and things like that.
Yeah, and when it comes to like I have knowledge or how I have knowledge, the how I have knowledge is in the being mode because it is a process. And a process is you're doing the process and being the doer of the process.
That's right. And so we have 4 different kinds of knowing that we went over previously. And in this part, we're talking about the participatory and the perspectival sorts of knowing that are part of our being
and
mode.
A descriptive, like we can describe the facts of what we know, and then the interpretive.
Yes.
Well, how did I come to the conclusion with this set of data, right?
Yeah, and we have to understand the distinction between descriptive knowledge and interpretive knowledge. Understanding is to grasp the significance of what you know.
Yeah. So
wisdom is understood as not the product, but the process.
Yeah.
How do I know something rather than what is it that I know? How we grasp significance. So this is kind of a transframing because it can be in a both and mode instead of an either or mode.
Yeah, it's not either the process or the product, but it's both the process and the product, and then more than just the process.
More so process than product, but there is some product in there, and that's a part of the interpretive knowledge.
I guess the product is a given, right? Like you can automatically see the product, right?
Right.
The process takes looking into.
Yes, that makes sense. So we got to looking at awe, and we mentioned awe, horror, awe, and wonder, how awe encompasses everything from horror to wonder, in fact.
And in humiliation, but not in the sense of like degradation, but in the sense of humility and humbling as well. Wisdom has a perspectival and participatory component to it. It's about what
perspectives are we taking?
What perspectives or identity are you assuming?
Yes.
Moving through one frame, and constantly moving through one framing to another, transframing.
That's right.
So yeah, and then we took a break.
It's opening up and opening. So it's opening up to something, but it's also opening up through the knowing of something.
Yeah, and opening up through through your own error. Seeing through something.
That's right. You had an error,
past.
but it's helping you get closer to the solution
and
now.
understanding the
And
error
so you're getting that
itself,
whole interpretive framing. And this is how we overcome foolishness. This is how our brains systematically overcome self-deception. This is how we formed rationality.
Yeah, and rationality cannot be reduced to just
Logic and mere reasoning. We have to rehabilitate what rationality actually means, because we've lost the definition over time.
Yeah, so the definition of rationality I have right here is rationality is the capacity to overcome self-deception in a reliable and systematic manner.
That's right.
Affording the flourishing and optimization of your cognition.
That's it.
And optimization, keyword, is like, it's not maximization or minimization. It's optimization, which means it's constantly changing and moving.
To further afford that flourishing and thriving.
There is no endpoint, optimal point, for something.
So rationality versus expertise. Now Vervaeke gets into this. We got to understand that rationality is different than expertise, and we're talking about expertise in the term of the way a lawyer is an expert of law, or tennis.
Yeah,
like
or a
pro
chef
tennis
is an
player
expert of food,
expert.
or a physicist is an expert in how things move and why.
Right. So an authority of expertise, not just good.
Yeah.
And we can recognize how expertise is domain specific.
Yeah.
It's not something that you can expand over many different domains. You can't take your tennis skill and play squash well. Or he also gave the golf to hockey.
Yeah, so it's non-transferable from one thing to another. It's non-transferable.
In fact, it could even interfere with your ability. If you're really used to hitting golf balls and then you're out there on the ice trying to hit a hockey puck, it's a totally different thing.
And that's why, there is a logical fallacy of, the appeal to authority or expertise. Even though,
So you can't ask a physics expert about a deep philosophical question and expect him to be reliable.
Yeah.
Even though that they're kind of similar domains and that they're trying to understand the nature of reality, the physicist is going to have trouble with a very deep philosophical inquiry that he's never come across.
And maybe
before.
not always, because you can develop.
If he's highly rational.
You can develop, and you can develop expertise among multiple things in your life.
Sure, you can, of course, absolutely. So what we're noticing here now is that rationality applies across many domains.
Yeah. Whereas expertise is limited in its domain.
It's basically when one can recognize their own capacity for self-deception, they can check themselves in all various aspects of life or whatever they're dealing with. And so rationality is domain general rather than context specific or domain specific. So we're looking for a way to reliably and systematically overcome self-deception. And we notice how even our goals, when we're being rational, come under revision as we optimize our functioning to afford flourishing.
So ideally, we would want to create or optimize a set of procedures that optimizes your cognition and constantly revising your goals. So that's too optimized, but basically we get a set of procedures, optimize the usage of those procedures, how much of one or the other at any given point in time, for the end goal of optimizing your cognition through continuously revising your goals.
Right.
Because as you go, as the optimization, your goals are going to change, because once you get say the product of one end, it's okay, well, now I have this product. I got to go, look back through why has this product come out? What's the significance of it? Instead of just saying, well, there's the product. And that gets us into, when we're talking about the rationality debate and what we did with, so basically you can run an experiment. So you give people, let's see, you can give people problems to solve and notice how they solve them. So the process of it. And in the case of the pond and the lily pad experiment, the idea is you have a pond that starts out with one lily pad, and each day it doubles. And there's a period of time which is 20 days. So they, say it takes 20 days to fill this lily pad starting at 1, and each day it doubles. When will the pond be halfway filled?
Yeah.
Most people say day 10, right?
That's right.
Because that's where
So your brain jumps to a conclusion.
half.
Your insight
Yeah.
machinery, your relevance realization machinery in our cognition is trying to do its thing, but it has an error.
Yep.
The
and
correct answer is day 19.
19, because then
Because
the
of
next
course
day,
it doubles every day, so you want it to be 10 the day before, so it doubles and hits 20 on the last day.
Yeah. And that's almost to be expected, because like I can see the error pretty quickly right there. It's like you see, half. Okay, so the pond, when's the pond going to be half filled? Well, half the days, so on day 10. But you weren't taking into account the doubling factor, which is something that
Right.
when you do 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, that's fine. But at a certain point, your brain just lumps it all together
Right.
and doesn't want to do it. And unless you're like,
Well, it's trying to be speedy about it.
yeah,
It's
sure,
trying to do it in an optimal way for us.
It's trying to
And
be
this is
efficient.
typically a very reliable part of our.
Oh, sure,
We have to find tricky questions to fool it. But the whole point of us going over this, and there's a point of us rehashing all of this right now, is because it's setting up something big, and that Vervaeke will go further into in this episode. So the point here is that we are all subject to what is termed critical detachment. That we should know we should be able to independently evaluate an argument, regardless of our preference for a certain conclusion.
Sure, yeah, like the way I keep this.
But we all have confirmation bias.
Yeah, the way I keep this in my head is most of the time I'd be more likely to follow a bad argument that leads to the conclusion I want than a good argument that leads away from it.
Right.
And now you multiply that by the mass of humans all in the world, all doing that same thing. It would look like humans are very, very irrational creatures.
In some ways. Yeah.
But we can move our attention from the product to the process to help us individually. And then, once you teach this and find an optimal system for teaching this, you can get more and more people looking at the process, the argument, opposed to just the product, and help detach themselves from the egoic
attachment to an idea.
what's
preferred
the
outcome.
Confirmation bias. That's what. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what you said. So
there was another great example that he gave of what happened. So we had two groups in this experiment, and they were asked, or they were basically told that we are going to test you guys on your ability to detect the authenticity of suicide notes. And, if someone really means it, basically. And so these, two groups went through the test. One group was told, you guys did a really good job. Thank you. We got a lot of good data from that. That's really helpful. The second group was told that they did a bad job. And
completely arbitrary, too.
Yeah.
As it turns out, none of the notes were real.
That's right, because in the debrief afterwards, they then showed them that actually the feedback was random and all the notes were fake. So they randomly picked which group was going to be the good one, which was going to be the bad one, and all of the notes were actually fake. There weren't even real people writing them, and they weren't determining anything. Now, here's the rest of the experiment.
Well, hold on. Before you go to that, though, this should completely undermine their feelings of how good they are at it. Once you tell them, it was arbitrary and they're all fake.
That's what I was about to say.
Yeah.
That's right. Because, the belief, and as you suggested now, the belief that one is good or bad should be undermined now. When you're told you got, okay, so what we just told you that you did a good job wasn't actually true. You didn't do a good job because the whole thing was fake. No offense or anything, but you couldn't have done a good job if you tried. The whole thing was fake. There's no real suicide notes. So now they asked them, well, okay, so if we guys gave you a test to determine, you're going to read letters and you're going to determine whether or not a marriage is going to end in a divorce or not. Do you think that you'd do good at this?
Yeah,
the group that was told that they were good in the first place, and even though afterward they're told the experiment was fake, still thought that they would do better. They scored higher than the B group that was told they were bad initially. So these people still think they have a confirmation bias built in now from being told that they were good at doing something. Even after they're told that the whole experiment was fake, when they're asked a similar question, now they are going to score higher than the other group, thinking that they're going to do well at it.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect example of our confirmation bias, the conjunction fallacy that we fall victim to so often.
Yeah, and what that is we're acknowledging the principles that we are using, but we're not applying them.
That's right. And so once again, we're recognizing also in our evolution, in the way our cognition developed, the very things that make us adaptive can also make us prone to self-deception. So we have to be constantly on watch for when we bullshit ourselves.
And this is called belief severance or belief perseverance.
Yes.
So, which is the people will stick reliably to which group they were assigned.
We can maintain a belief even after it is undermined.
So we need to save ourselves from this systematic illusion,
Delusion.
particularly the idea that humans are irrational. Because if humans in fact are irrational, then what's your reasoning for supporting democracy or choice or any of that? If humans are naturally irrational, that completely undermines the fabric of Western society and a lot of Eastern society and Southern society and all society, pretty much, that think that humans should be making their own decisions, except for the most controlling.
Because that's basically what these experimenters thought they were finding, that humans are innately irrational.
Yeah.
Well,
but
it's not that simple.
That's an error in and of itself.
That's an error themselves that we'll get into now.
So should we interpret these experiments as they are? The humans are irrational.
Well, then good luck justifying democracy if they are, and
morality comes from rationality, says a wiser man than me. And so if you can't be rational and hold, rational ideas in yourself, like how can you be a moral agent?
Well, that's it, because now we recognize that rationality does in fact depend on morality.
No, morality.
Morality depends on rationality. And rationality isn't just a fact; it goes deeply into who and what we are.
Yeah. So
deeply into our perspectival knowing and our participatory knowing.
Yeah. So Cohen argued that there's a problem with the human irrationality argument.
Because rationality is a deeply existential aspect of our cognition.
So if we go back to Kant,
or our experience, I would say, if it's existential. Go ahead.
Kant has one point to be rational is to acknowledge and follow a set of standards. And where do we get these standards? How do we where does our normative theory come from? Right.
Mm-hmm. That's the question.
So like, where are we getting it from? Or we getting it from up above, or some aliens, or some tablets we found in the ground or something. Well, no, really, not it's
actually autonomous
and within us
and
it's not a command,
and it's within the world in a way, but it's because we figure out what is rational by, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but by measuring our competence and performance at something, and then where we had performance issues, okay, well, let's X that out, and you start getting the ability to reason what actually was useful. So that's how rationality informs itself, and it's autonomous.
That's if you ought to do something, you should be able. So ought can.
Yeah, ought implies
if you ought
can.
to be able to do it, you should be able to do it. So you can acknowledge the standard. So when we're like the standard here, to go back, because
you can't say that somebody should do something that they wouldn't normally be able to do.
Really
but
quick,
morally, we can all recognize where we went wrong in something, and that's where rationality works very well.
So the acknowledgement that the standards are right assumes the knowledge of the goodness of the standard within itself. So you can acknowledge the standard and still fail the standard. You can see the goodness in how the standard is right, but still fail at the standards. And there's two kinds of mistakes we do. There's a competency, so your capability, and a performance, and which is what you have done. And those two come together into implementation processes. You can do it, but something may be interfering with it. Say, I'm trying to talk, but I'm drunk, so it's not coming out. Well, you wouldn't say that I lost the capability of talking. No, there's just something in the way, right? So
Yeah, it's not like you lost English or something like that. You still have access to language. You could still
yeah.
speak.
Where do we come up with these standards? And this is what you're talking about. So you have your competency, your your idealization minus the errors. So you
Mm-hmm.
have your ideal, what you want, your competency to do it, and then minus the errors that you're having.
Mm-hmm.
So all the errors in this experiment that we had with the suicide note experiment are not competency errors, but performance
Their
errors.
performance
You're
errors.
capable and competent enough to be rational,
That's right.
but you're failing on the performance level. So
Yes.
what would be
Yes.
getting in the way?
And of course, they failed on the performance level because they gave them bad data. They gave them a fake experiment. So the researchers jumped to a conclusion themselves.
Sure. Well, but
As a
both
result, they
it
didn't
showed you
recognize this as a performance error.
the whole system of errors gave us insight into
Mm-hmm.
more than just the errors of the people being experimented on, but also the errors of those who would like to use that experiment
Or
to say
perform
that
it.
humans are
Mm-hmm.
irrational creatures.
Right.
So we need to be competently
We
rational.
have to constantly be aware of. You see, okay, so constantly aware of how rationality is helping us attune to reality, but we can constantly make value judgments.
Sure.
And where was that? One little. We can know that it's best to change a belief when new data comes along and gives us new information.
Well, don't you remember?
Yet, if we're really attached to that belief, we can very easily still believe something even though we've been presented with information that falsifies.
Don't you remember in 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, all of our very intelligent, competent friends were like, be careful of confirmation bias, and if I see new information, I'll change my mind. And well, now those same friends seem to be the ones committing the fallacies the worst. And it's not because they're irrational and they're stupid and there's something wrong with them. It's that they're having a performance error. They're not applying their principles. And I think ego is the thing that gets in the way most of the time because,
That's
like,
it.
well, just like, Group A.
We don't want to hear that.
We were
but
told we were right in Group A. So, like,
our self-image, our attachments to our beliefs and how we view ourselves in respect to those beliefs that we hold, all of these things are being upset. And it's a very uncomfortable situation when your very basis for reality is being challenged. So we will initially push away against something that disproves something that we've long held to be true or that we recently learned that we really feel strongly about.
It's sometimes like viscerally painful, like in
And
you.
it's oftentimes very tribal. You're going to believe what your tribe believes before you even really look at it yourself because your tribes typically seem to be right. There's a lot of intelligent people in your tribe. You're intelligent too, so you feel like you can figure things out without having to look at much information. And so it's really easy for us to be lied to, especially when much of the psychological manipulation methodology is actually acting on us emotionally.
Sure.
So it's bypassing our intellect and hitting us emotionally in our psychology, and that way we can also be lied to and manipulated very easily.
Emotion, much like ego, is a necessary tool for singular creatures like ourselves to come to understand the world. We're just unoptimizing the tool that is the ego and experiencing or being moved by unoptimized emotions, because you should have an emotional response to something. You don't like in the right emotional response. You don't want to laugh at a funeral unless like your buddy's kind of that way and he's like, when I die, bury me ass up. And
The emotions can be powerful tools for us, but we can become identified with our emotions. We start thinking that everything that's happening in our mind, every thought that comes into your head, and every emotion that comes through you, we think it's what we are, and we're actually the observer. If you notice, you will notice that you can see the thoughts come up in your mind. Then you can even see your emotional reaction to those thoughts from a place of beyond emotionality. It's just this awareness. It's crazy. You can even be aware of your emotions as they come up. And if you notice, the awareness itself of the emotion is not any kind of emotion. It's just there. If it's anything, it's actually, if you notice and you really delve into it and sit with it for a while, it's quite blissful and peaceful and beautiful and loving. But it's not marred by any of our body, minds, emotions. And that's why mindfulness practice can be so helpful for us, because we start seeing between our thoughts and around our thoughts, and we start getting more space in the space-time continuum in which we can respond to our thoughts.
So
You don't immediately react to them and identify with them. You're like, oh, that was that was kind of a funny thought to have. I can see where that comes from in my conditioning because I grew up around these kinds of people in this place. And it's really cool. You learn about how your brain ticks, and then you gain mastery over it.
and try real hard not to get, what do the kids call it, black pilled, with yourself, like realize, like
Hopeless
getting too
down.
far into the Hamlet end where you're reflecting too far, and then the gap like freezes you up, and you're like, screw everything.
Well, notice the
I'm
self-judgment that's
yeah,
occurring
I'm just
too.
messed
Yeah.
up, like I'm just a messed up person that'll destroy everything
Yeah,
in
don't
my
believe
life, and
don't believe your thoughts. Don't believe the fears. Just notice them. Recognize that they're there.
well, and let them inform you of like, because
Oh, if there's
you
something
may
to be cautionary about,
sure.
for sure,
But, this is back to
consider:
the-
is it something that I need to be cautionary about or not?
From-
Am I just amping up my sense of fear over something?
Yeah, so from not the last episode, but the episode before that, we talked about the signal noise and the deciding line. Like if like the so for example, your emotions. If you're getting way too pulled into your emotions and they're overtaking you, you've moved your decision line over into the noise end too far. Whereas if you're too cold and you don't have emotions and you can't relate, you're moving it too far into the signal side. I'm not going to have an emotion unless something really but I don't care about anybody, or I don't care enough, so I'm not going to have any. Or so there's this line we've got to be between the signal and the noise, and your ego can function as a signal and noise mechanism as well.
Sometimes you need to let more noise in because you're trying to figure something out. Sometimes you need to let less noise in because you're just trying to relax.
Yeah.
And you only need to let enough noise in that will tell you if there's something really dangerous.
Yeah,
But if your noise is turned way up and it's time to relax, and you're just sitting there thinking and worrying about stuff, you're gonna have a hard time getting relaxed.
Yeah,
So
if you just out of nowhere have an extreme bout of anxiety, pay attention to that and go, that's not normal. Maybe it's something I'm eating. Maybe I've consumed a toxin, like certain like poisons, like household chemicals and other stuff like that. If you're real sensitive, if you get exposed, will throw you into real bad anxiety. Yes, sometimes that's okay, but other times you can just be like, oh no, I know where this anxiety is coming from, and back to signal.
That's right.
Whereas like if you out of nowhere are having that reaction, you're probably going to go into some weird type of allergic attack or something like that, or you're just eating bad food and you probably shouldn't be eating that food because your body just doesn't like it. And that line is always moving. It's optimizing depending.
That's right. Depending on the situation. That's our relevance realization machinery at work. And keep using the word machinery. It's obviously not the right word for what's happening in our cognition.
Machinery. It's
psycho how our mind, how our brain works. And again, guys, we're going through all of this stuff, trying to understand what wisdom is, what rationality is, because we're trying to understand how humanity can, and we ourselves can, awaken from the meaning crisis that our species finds itself in at this point in history. If you all out there recognize the ongoing division, the breakdown, the distrust, and the previously trusted various systems of authority, science and religion and government and education, academia, everything is all being brought into question. Media, our journalism, everything. And we don't know what to trust. There's a great sense of loss of meaning in our lives. And we're experiencing what we call domicide, which is loss of a sense of home. And that happens during periods of great disruption. And this is actually a perennial problem that the human species faces. It's something that has been recurrent, that we seem to revisit.
Yeah.
And so the meaning crisis, I would say, and Vervaeke would probably agree, is at the root of the many myriad meta crises that we're facing. So the meta crisis is a term for the many myriad existential, life-threatening crises our species is facing.
Yeah, I think the
how do we solve for this complex set of problems that our species finds itself in? Because it's not a good situation for us if things continue going the direction they're going. Yeah. How do we help rewind that process or create a counteractive dynamical system to counteract the downward spiral?
Yeah, so the meaning crisis would be top pinnacle crisis, and underneath of that is a set of meta crises, and then a set of existential crises, and then a set of very personal crises. Mm-hmm. And it all comes up to, meaning and connectedness to this world. And the historical factors of the past, 500 years or so play a huge role in us losing a lot of techniques and applications of machinery, both
used to help us
social
develop
and
wisdom.
personal,
Yeah.
that would help us with this ultimate, like, is the meaning. What is the meaning of life? That is like the oldest freaking question.
We need wisdom to answer this question for ourselves in this time. And how do you cultivate wisdom?
Yeah, and since the severance of,
Because there's nowhere to go for wisdom, right?
but
Since the severance, you were saying.
since the severance between religion and
Science.
and well, no, not religion and science, but religion and state,
Okay.
like, and rule of man, now there's two separate things. We threw out a lot of things that religion being integrated with the ruling of groups of people did pretty well. And for good reason it was separated at the time. For good reason it was
It's the
separated.
best humans had come up with so far. And
But
we're
now
evolving here.
we're working on trying to reincorporate what it is that religion did without having this necessity for any religion,
The dogma
in particular, like
of the religions, because people can still have their religions.
Sure, yeah, and
but
actually,
the close ended saying our way is the only way, certainty, that isn't willing to reason with other spiritual systems out there and find that there's actually a lot of validity in the insights and the wisdom that other systems, other mystery schools or wisdom traditions can give us. And in fact, there's a lot of very complementary root level insights that each of all the major world's religions stem from, such as love being the supreme unifying principle of life. Martin Luther King stated that this was the one main thing that all the great religions of the world agree on.
And even allows us to see the systematic errors in all religions as well. Even if, like, I'm a Christian, I realize there's some errors in there.
How do we bring the open-endedness back to our myth making?
Yeah.
Say these stories aren't done, and this isn't
more of to actually seeing why we're making these errors within our religion, thus making religion itself better and the religion of no religion better, and making humans better.
Yeah,
because
making religion possible without any specific religion.
Yeah,
yes, the methodology
making
of
religion itself even better. Because like this idea that it's like it has to be the way it was. It's like no religion was ever like that.
The way it was, yeah, they've all been changing.
We wouldn't have
time.
Christianity.
The interpretation of them.
You wouldn't have Judaism because they would still all be like pagan druids or whatever.
That's
in
right.
that region that they were.
Yeah.
It's always about improving, because ultimately religion is supposed to help you improve yourself and transcend the baser animal side of yourself to become more like your creator, or at least like if you believe in the creator having an intention for you, what your creator intended you to really truly be, which is always higher than what you are now. No matter whether you're pauper, alcoholic, or priest, you can always be better than that. So it's like we need to rescue a lot of things that we threw away in our full forwardly flung pursuit to, for good or for bad, make man better. Even socialism tried to do that. They want a socialized man that can live and just be fine with not owning anything and just having it open to everybody.
They thought they could do it by brute force.
And they also forgot that
coercion.
Human nature is a freaking thing.
Yeah.
So we're always going to make these systematic errors as humans because of our nature. You can't just put up a system there and the system will socialize the man. It's like nah.
It doesn't quite work that way.
How many millions has gotta die? Like, and even religion over time is I'm bashing socialism, but for good reasons. But religion throughout time, we've realized when it ossifies and gets corrupted and then shatters itself down or is shattered by something else,
turns into 1,000 different sects of the same religion.
Like what Martin Luther had very good reasons for not liking the Catholic Church and not wanting the Catholic Church to have ultimate say of what what people do. So it's like, okay, well, we'll let the state deal with this. We'll create this thing that's the state that's aside for
a whole new slew of problems resulted.
And it just did what the worst parts of the church were doing, that just without God. Or without the
religion went from something that was about faithfulness to a way of being to faith as in just believing and proclaiming that you believe. Well, for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's lazy
and that's the way it began to be preached more. And understood more by people.
I'll call that lazy faith. It's just I could just say this. And
Well,
I'm done.
there's many misunderstandings and errors that happened over history,
Sure.
and that's what we've been tracking in this series to understand what exactly happened to get us into this meaning crisis. Well, it's a combination of historical factors from the last few hundred or more years,
And even
plus
a
the
few
perennial
thousand, too.
recurring problems that always seem to return to challenge our species.
The rise and fall of Rome did a whole hell of a lot to humans' perception of the world and our relationship with it as well too, and that's older than 500. So it's like we're constantly going to be having the same core fundamental problems coming up, and there will always be a historical component. And most recently, which is most salient to most of us, if you are the type to pay attention to history, if you're not, you probably have no clue, unfortunately. Now the new meme or whatever trend is men thinking about the Roman Empire, and I didn't hear about any of that until that meme started being a thing, and it was just like, no, okay, yeah, some of them do, but there's a lot of like male history nuts and shit, and the Roman Empire facilitates looking into like, okay, well, there's the warrior attitude on their side, but then you could be or you could be the horde on the other side, being completely destroyed by this huge military force or
As
anywhere
I
in
understood
between.
it, a lot of guys were looking into ancient Greece and Stoicism prior even to the Roman Republic.
Yeah, well,
But, hey, what do you do?
The internet,
We're
it's a
interested
thing.
in one thing that Vervaeke pointed out in the very first episode of this series is that not only is there an increased sense of meaninglessness in the world and there's a meaning crisis, but there's also a revolution of interest in mindfulness practices. So a revolution of interest in ancient Western philosophy and ancient Eastern philosophy. All of a sudden, the bookshelves here in the U.S. started getting filled up, and in the West as a whole, started getting filled up with books from the East on Buddhism and Tao Te Ching and Taoism in general and yoga.
We definitely saw how it shaped our popular culture too, like the Beatles. The Beatles were, forgive me for saying this, a totally different band before they, went out to India and did their thing, and then started doing all the drugs. Which I'm not saying like bad things. The Beatles were great; they're brilliant and everything, but they were definitely a product of their age.
Yeah.
But then you can see it in our pop culture. Just the sound of a sitar playing over classical rock music gets you in a certain way that's very, even though it's British guys, very American nostalgia. Even though it's a British band playing an Indian instrument, it still gets you this like America, 60s, 70s, yeah,
It became such a part of that time and that era and a part of our culture. And, we here in America are a melting pot. And all these amazing things that have come out of our country are due to that melting pot occurring. Rock and roll would not have happened without the melting pot, nor would stand-up comedy or film or any of the other things that we found appeal to a wide variety of different peoples and even cultures because it worked here when many people made it together from variant cultures. And that's why our culture is spread around the world so powerfully, because it's tuned to many cultures, intermeshing and intermingling.
Yeah, intermeshing and intermingling, not being separate from each other, but coming together.
There's going to be some clashing involved when the cultures meet, but they also can become complementary and even intermesh and intermingle with one another, and then something new develops, and that's beautiful. That's so exciting.
And particularly here in America, because like to be an American comes with the mindset of like personal flourishing, getting on with people as much as possible. I'm not going to step on your toes if you don't step on my toes.
Hard work to realize your vision.
And even though there isn't huge barren landmass for us to move out into anymore, there is still, for now, economic mobility upward. And if you work hard, you can do that. So that's the American culture that then is informed by all the different cultures that came here. And from, like suffering and persecution. And you'd think, like, oh, well, this would just be a land of, poor victims that have a victim mentality. It wasn't until recently that it was cool to push this victim mentality shit.
First world problems, baby.
Yeah, it was actually like, in spite of all that stuff,
we're
strong
the
now
new
and
problems
doing good.
that are big and popular in America and other leading industrialized nations are not issues for poorer countries.
Yeah,
at all. You gotta be very privileged to be able to complain about the things that we complain about today.
Well, we've been brutalized and victimized, which means we've been turned into brutes and victims by
we have also been played against each other with divide and conquer methodology.
Bad ideologies, man. And it's just like
you
don't learn when you're constantly in the receding victim state. A beaten dog doesn't learn to sit. It just learns how to not get beaten.
Truth.
So don't be the beaten dog, because you're
Amen
just
to that,
beating
man.
yourself. Unless somebody's actually physically beating you, and then I'd advise defending yourself.
Yeah. And on that note,
Yeah.
we are going to consider what is rationality. This is episode 41 of John Vervaeke's Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, guys. We are diving in now. Here we go.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. So we are pursuing the cognitive science of wisdom because wisdom has always been associated with meaning right from the axial revolution onward. So that's a deep reason. Wisdom, of course, is also important for the cultivation of enlightenment, the response to the perennial problems. It's also playing a central role in being able to interpret our scientific worldview in a way that allows us to respond to the historical forces. And so wisdom is very important. We took a look at, we continued to look at McGee and Barber, and we saw their convergence argument that at the core of wisdom is the systematic seeing through of illusion and into what's real. And this is very much like as the child is to the adult is to the sage. And then two other important aspects of it, that wisdom is much more with how you know than what you know, which means how you come to know it, and also how you interpret the knowledge. And that wisdom is, therefore, in a related fashion, deeply perspectival and participatory, and that's why wisdom can be associated with important forms of pragmatic self-contradiction. We then noted the connection with overcoming self-deception in a systematic fashion, and the emphasis on wisdom on the process rather than the products of knowing. And that both of those took us into the work of Stanovich, and because he famously argues that one of the hallmarks of rationality is valuing the process rather than rathering the process in addition to valuing the products of our cognition. And that took us also into the notion, the discussion of rationality, and Stanovich is a good bridge because for him the notions of rationality and ameliorating foolishness overlap very strongly. And we got into this notion of, and which I've been sort of comprehensively arguing throughout this course, that rationality has to do with the reliable and systematic overcoming of self-deception and the potential affording of flourishing by some process of optimization of achieving our goals, with the caveat that as we try to optimize, we often change the goals that we are pursuing. One reason being that we come to more and more appreciate the value of the process as opposed to just the end result of the process. So, in order to pursue that and to deepen our notion of rationality and thereby deepen our notion of wisdom, and of course wisdom has been associated with rationality from the beginning, Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, right? We took a look at the rationality debate. We saw, I gave you 3 examples of many possible examples of experimental results that seem to show reliably this kind of thing, very reliably. No replication crisis on this material. So very reliably, 2 things, that people acquiesce, they acknowledge and accept the authority of certain standards, principles of how they should reason, and yet they reliably fail to meet those standards. And so one possible interpretation of that, not the only interpretation, one possible interpretation is that most people are irrational in nature. As I pointed out, because rationality is existential and not just sort of abstract theoretical, concluding that people are irrational has important implications for their moral status, their political status, their legal status, even their developmental status. Okay, so this is what I keep meaning when I'm saying rationality is deeply existential. It is not just theoretical. Okay. We took a look at the beginning of what's called the rationality debate, and good science always has good debate in it. The rationality debate, and the argument, it was made by Cohen, that human beings can't be comprehensively irrational because we have to ask this very pertinent question: where do the standards come from? And the argument is the standards have to come from us. And how do we come up with that normative theory? We come up with that normative theory that acknowledges, right, the way we come up with our normative theory is consonant with that we're the source of our standards. And this is the idea that at the level of my competence contains all the standards. And that what I do in order to get my normative theory is I idealize away all my performance errors, and this takes time, takes a lot of reflection, right, until I get at the underlying competence. And then what I'm doing when I'm proposing a normative theory is I'm giving people this now explicated, excavated account of the competence that they possess, and then demanding from them that they do their best to reduce the performance errors and meet that competence. So at the level of our competence, we are fundamentally rational. And all of the mistakes that people are making in these experiments, according to Cohen, are just performance errors. They're just performance errors. Okay? And just like you do not think I've lost English because of all of my performance errors, you basically dismiss them and read through them and attribute to me the underlying competence. Cohen is arguing we should read through and dismiss these experimental results, and because the argument shows that people must have the underlying competence. Okay, so how does Stanovich reply to this? Well, in many places, but I think the best is Stanovich and West, 2000, in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, because the argument that this is a really, for me, a gold standard of how you do really good cognitive science. The way they integrate philosophical, psychological argumentation together, for example, is really, really, really impressive. So Stanovich and West say, well, if Cohen is right, then all of the errors that people are making are performance errors. And Cohen is invoking the competence-performance distinction. Which, of course, goes back through, to Chomsky and ultimately to Piaget. Now, let's remember Piaget, because we've talked about this. Well, how do you distinguish the child's, right, speech deficits from the drunkard's, right? The drunkard is giving performance error, but we think the child actually, her competence, for example, is not sufficiently developed. Why do we think that? Why do we think when the children are making all these conservation errors, right, that reflects something about their competence at that point? Well, that's because competence errors that reflect a defect or a deficit in competence are systematic errors. That's precisely how Piaget did his work, right? That's precisely how you would determine that if I got brain damage and I'm leaving out, right, my sentences are broken, that it is not performance error, because my errors would be systematic. Across different contexts, different times of day, different tasks, I'd be making these mistakes. Performance errors are not systematic, right? So if my speech is broken because I'm rushing, right, it's not going to be broken when I'm not rushing. If my speech is broken when I'm tired, it's not going to be broken when I'm not tired. So this is circumstantially driven. Right? And as the circumstances change, the patterns of error will change and go all over the place. So these errors are not systematic in nature. Okay? Well, that means we have a reliable way of telling whether or not the errors that the people are making in the experiments are performance errors or not. How do you see if errors are systematic? Well, this is what you do. Errors are systematic if, when I make this error, it's highly predictive that I'll make this error. It's highly predictive that I make this error. It's highly predictive that I'll make this error. So if a child is showing conservation in this task, that's predictive that they'll fail to show conservation, right, in this task, in this task, in this task, right? So the degree to which, we've talked about this before, the degree to which there's a positive manifold. Remember when we talked about general intelligence. The degree to which your performance in one task is predictive of how you'll do on other tasks. If you have a manifold in your performance, if the errors are systematic across many different tasks that you're performing, then that's evidence that the errors are systematic rather than not systematic. Okay, so that's easy enough. So then what we can do is and we've got all this data, we can look at all people doing these different experiments. And in many experiments, they're doing multiple versions. The same participant is doing one task or not. So what we can do is the following. We can see if I, for example, if I make a failure in critical detachment, does that mean that I'll also tend to show belief perseverance? Does that also mean that I'll tend to leap to the wrong conclusion when I was doing the task on, the lily pads covering the pond? And the answer, and this is what there is overwhelming evidence for, is yes. The errors you make are systematic. They're systematic. And see, so now, Stanovich and West say, Cohen's argument predicts that the errors are performance errors. That's what he claims. That means that the errors should be not systematic, but what we find is overwhelming, convincing evidence that the errors that people are making in all these tasks are systematically related together. So these are errors at the level of competence. And now you go, what? And this is what I mean about good debate makes something problematic, right? Because there's something right about Cohen's argument, and Stanovich acknowledges it, right? There's something right in that we have to be the source, right, of our standards, and yet Cohen's conclusion that all the errors are performance errors is wrong. It's undeniably wrong. How do we put these together? Well, you put these together, and you can see Stanovich and West doing this to varying degrees. You put this together by stepping back and looking at an assumption that's in Cohen's argument. It's an assumption about the competence. Cohen is assuming that that competence for rationality is a single competence. He's assuming that that competence is static. Right? He's also assuming that the competence is completely individualistic. Okay? I'll come back to this one much later. I'm going to address these two because Stanovich really doesn't talk about this. So remember that, but we'll come back to it later. Think about the Platonic idea. What if I have two competences that both are working towards getting me to reliably achieve my goals, correct my own behavior? But these competencies could actually conflict with each other. That would mean I would be the source of all the standards. Here are all the standards here. Here are all the standards here. I'm the source for all the standards. But at the level of my competence, I can be generating error because these two competencies can actually be in conflict with each other. So the way you start to resolve this debate, and this has become a central idea in psychology, in cognitive psychology and cognitive science, is that we don't have a single competency. We have to have multiple competencies. And what that means is, and this is why, for example, assuming uncritically assuming that you could reduce rationality and identify it with the single competence of syllogistic reasoning is just fundamentally wrong. It's not paying attention to the science. Here's another issue. Cohen is assuming that your competence is full-blown, it's finished, it's static, it's done. But, and I sort of slipped this in, notice the examples I used of small children. Their competence, for example, in English, or whatever language they're speaking. I happen to be speaking English, that's why I'm using it. The little girl, the 2.5-year-old, her competence is not fully developed. She will come to have those standards as that competency fully develops. But as that competency is immature, she can be a source of error from her competence. So, right, we have to give up the assumption that our competence, again, is static. Why would it be? Your cognition is inherently dynamic and developmental. Again, assuming, oh no, this is just what it is. Right? And assuming that there is a single thing we're pointing to when we point to rationality is a mistake. See, this way, Stanovich and West can say, and it's brilliant, right? It's brilliant. They can say, Cohen's argument is fundamentally right, but his conclusion, the specific conclusion, is wrong because the conclusion that the errors are only performance errors is only a conclusion based on the hidden premise, right, that the competence is single and static. You have multiple competencies, and they're in ongoing development. Okay, so we've learned something very interesting. So what's happening is, and Stanovich is an advocate of this, right? You have dual processing models. This is the idea that we have different ways of processing information. Think of how Platonic this is. How much Plato was going, I told you this a long time ago, right? We have different styles, ways of processing information that are good for different kinds of problem solving. And neither one of these competencies can be, right, exclusive or sufficient for us. But they have, right, ultimately a complementary relationship, a relationship, I would argue, of opponent processing. Stanovich has a different view, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay, second person in the debate, and you've heard me mention him, and you've heard me talk about him with serious respect, and he is given serious respect by Stanovich and West. Cherniak has a much different approach to the rationality debate. He agrees with Stanovich and West that the difficulty is not at the level of our performance, it's at the level of our competence. But he has a different move to make. He has a move that you saw me invoke last time. This is the odd implies can. So this is the question whether or not, right, whether or not we're applying the right normative theory to people in these experiments when we're judging them to be irrational. So Cherniak invokes something that you saw me invoke multiple times when we talked about relevance realization. We're in the finitary predicament. This is actually his term. Right? We cannot, because it is combinatorially explosive, derive all the implications. We cannot consider all of our assumptions. All of the stuff that we've talked about before. We cannot go back and recreate all of the ways in which we've represented something. This is combinatorially explosive. What we do, right? Do we just arbitrarily choose whatever implication we want? No. So here's the point, right? We can't be algorithmic, right? We can't use standards that work in terms of certainty and completeness. Because, for example, if I tried to be comprehensively, deductively logical, then I would fall very rapidly into combinatorial explosion for any problem that I'm trying to solve, and I would then have committed cognitive suicide. It cannot be a standard, a normative standard of rationality if trying to follow it would commit me to cognitive suicide, which would undermine any attempt to satisfy any of my goals. Do you see what Cherniak is saying, right? You can't do this, but of course you don't just arbitrarily choose whatever representation you want, choose whatever inference you want, choose to check whatever contradiction you want. So you can't check them all, and you can't just arbitrarily, well, what's the answer? Well, you saw the answer before, and it's one that I have talked. You choose, right? You do relevance. You pick the relevant implications. You check the relevant contradictions. You check, right, which aspects of your representation you consider relevant, etc. You do relevance realization. And Stanovich is like, yeah, that's right. We're not going to argue with that. And that's part of what I've been arguing throughout. There's this consensus on how central this ability is. At least it's an emerging consensus. Herbert Simon, from Newell and Simon, talks about bounded rationality, that we can't be purely computational, algorithmic, etc., for all of the reasons we've already explored. And then what Cherniak says is, but look what people are using in the experiments. They're using formal logic. They're using formal probability theory. They're using all these formal, purely algorithmic. By the way, you say, oh, but probability certainty doesn't work in certainty. Yes, it does. It gives you certainty about probabilities. That's what makes it a formal theory. That's why it has axioms and theorems, etc. Okay? Don't confuse properties of the theory with properties of what the theory is about. So what Cherniak says is the scientists in the experiment are using all these formal theories that can only be applied in very limited contexts. If I try to apply them comprehensively in my life, and that's where rationality matters, because rationality is an existential issue. If I try to apply it comprehensively in my life from within the finitary predicament, I am doomed to fail. And then you're laying an ought on me that I cannot possibly meet, which means you, scientist, have the wrong normative theory. Because if you're laying a normative theory on me that I cannot possibly meet, that's evidence that it's the wrong normative theory. And that's Cherniak's argument. It's a powerful argument. It's a good argument. It's an argument I take very seriously. Stanovich and West, they go, yes, all of this is right. However, Cherniak is talking about, he thinks he's talking about one thing, and he's actually talking about another. And this is such a clever response, and it's going to tell us something really, really important.
Break.
Before we go too much further into that.
Yeah.
So, Stanovich and West, 2000, behavioral and brain science. If Cohen is right, all the errors that people make are performance errors. But as Piaget said, questions, how do you distinguish between the errors of a child and versus a drunkard? So we look into
performance versus competence, right?
Yeah, well, systematic errors like the child does, and performance errors, which are non-systematic.
Circumstantial.
Yes, like your speech is broken up by circumstance, so not systematic. Many different things could be leading to it, opposed to repeatedly, reliably over many different tests, if you will.
So now we have a reliable way to test for the performance errors in those previous experiments that we were discussing.
Well, so we come up with an issue here, though. So it's like, while we're looking into, to see if these errors that we're making are systematic or performance, okay, we look into error one is reliably, if you have an error in test one, it's reliably predictable in test two, test three, test four that you have the same error across it. If I make an error in one test, do I make them in others? Are they systematic? Well, we tend to find that errors systematically opposed to, the errors in these tests are systematic opposed to performance, which is like, what? That means that the errors are competency errors. Oh no, like, it's like crap, like.
That's what that would be from an initial misunderstanding.
Well,
and so we got all this overwhelming evidence that rationality errors that we make are systematic, but Vervaeke really breaks this down for us here. And he goes on how Cohen notes that we have to be aware of our competence, yet there's an assumption here that is occurring. Cohen assumes competence is a very narrow thing. It's like singular, static, and individualistic.
Yeah, that was Stanovich and West's criticism.
That's
of
right.
The argument
Cohen,
was
yes.
was saying, assuming that competence is static.
Because and we can have two competencies to improve life that conflict with each other.
Yeah.
And then recognize, wait, I'm the source of all the standards, and now these two competencies are counteracting each other. So we have to understand we have to have multiple competencies that are not static. Standards grow as our competence grows.
Yeah, and so Cohen also assumed that competence is a finished product, but a child develops competency by overcoming error over time. So it's automatically not static. Competency is not a static
No, it's a
thing.
dynamic, growing thing for sure.
So we got to give up that static idea of competence.
That's right. Assuming there's a single way that rationality works is an error. So the Cohen argument that seemed fundamentally right, but its conclusion actually was wrong, is because the premise is competence is resting upon the idea that competency is singular and static, but we see that it's not. We have multiple modes and ways of problem solving. So there seems to be an opponent processing going on, a calibration and optimization process going on here.
The dual processing model.
And that's what the scientists were getting caught up on, because Vervaeke reminds us of the ought implies can argument. Are we applying the right normative theory to the participants of these experiments?
And that was Charniak.
And that was Charniak recognizing that there's what was it, affinitary or
finitary predicament. So we can't be algorithmic in certain, because then it leads us to combinatorial explosion and cognitive suicide. We just won't be able to do it. We don't got enough time in the universe and not enough energy.
Yeah, we can't use the standards of certainty and completeness that we would use when measuring something in physics, for instance. Just the weight of something, for instance.
Nor can we just be arbitrary either. We can't just arbitrarily decide either. So it's we must check what is relevant, and this is relevance realization.
Yes.
Which is okay, since you can't be algorithmic about it and you can't just be arbitrary, there's somewhere in between where something realizes what is relevant.
And the relevant aspects to solving the actual problem at hand. So the experimenters, we find, were using a very narrow, pointed process of trying to understand the results of their experiments. They didn't even realize that they were in the wrong.
Yeah, so formal logic and probability logic, which are both certainty-based, which are contextually limited. So the ought cannot be done.
That's right.
The evidence, the normative theory is wrong that was used in this test. So it set them up for failure in the beginning.
That's right.
Yeah. And that's all I have on that. But
yeah,
that was pretty dense, and
it was, because he really had to flesh out those examples there.
Man.
That really brings the point home even further now. So I'm glad he did that. So here we are, guys. We're jumping back in now. Let's go.
Charniak is talking about, he thinks he's talking about one thing, and he's actually talking about another. And this is such a clever response, and it's going to tell us something really, really important. Right? Okay, first of all, this tells you that again, here's another argument why you can't equate rationality with merely being logical, merely using probability theory, right? Does that mean I can be arbitrary and ignore logic? No. It's the much more difficult, and notice how this starts to overlap with wisdom. It's a much more difficult issue of knowing when, where, and to what degree I should use logic and probability in a formal manner, etc. Okay. How does Stanovich and West reply? Again, I think it's brilliant. They say, all of this is right, but it's not about rationality. All of this, right, all of this stuff, they tend to talk about it in terms, they use the phrase computational limitations. They always describe it sort of negatively instead of positively. Instead of relevance realization, although the two are interdefined, they always talk about it in terms of computational limitations. But they say all this stuff that Cherniak is talking about in terms of computational limitations is actually not about rationality. It's actually about intelligence. Now, this is going to be a brilliant move. And what it's going to also show us is there is and I said this a while ago, there's a deep difference between being intelligent and being rational. In fact, Stanovich is going to argue that what makes you foolish is you're highly intelligent and highly irrational. And that is going to make sense, right, of what we've already argued, that the very processes that make me adaptively intelligent are the very processes that also subject me to self-deception. How does he do this? Well, he basically argues, and you saw an analogous argument, how do they do this, and how does Stanovich do it elsewhere, right? They basically argue, right? When we test for people's ability to zero in on relevant information, right, how can we test to see how well people deal with computational limitations? So what Stanovich basically argues is, and again, myself and Leo Ferraro argued this in a convergent fashion, other people, right? Basically, what we're testing when we're testing people's intelligence is we're testing their capacity to deal with computational limitations. And this lines up again, also, you've heard me mention this, that measures of intelligence correlate with measures of working memory and blah, blah, blah. I've given you all that argument. Stanovich is giving you an additional argument here. He's saying, okay, so we understand intelligence as the capacity to deal with computational limitations. That's the negative way of putting it. I would say it's the capacity to do relevance realization, but let's keep going. And then we have a way of, therefore, measuring people's capacity to deal with computational limitations. So Cherniak is saying people fail in the experiment because of computational limitations. They're in the finitary predicament. And we have a way of measuring how well people can deal with computational limitations. That's intelligence. We have a way of measuring G. Reliable, robust way of measuring G. So now, notice what we can do. Again, so brilliant, right? We have reliable ways of measuring G. Remember what Stanovich and Weston showed with answer to Cohen? That all of the reasoning tasks also form a pause strongly manifold. They don't label anything, but I'm going to call it R. GR. All right? There's this general factor of reasoning because the reasoning tasks form a strong positive manifold. Okay, so what we can do is we can measure the G of R, right? And now we can do something very, very, very basic. If what's happening in the experiment is a measure of rationality, and rationality is equivalent to dealing with combinatorial explosion, computational limitations, then these two should approach parity. Intelligence and rationality should be identical. Right? So notice what's going on here. If Cherniak is right, then rationality and intelligence would be identical, and there would be a strong relationship between how intelligent you are and how well you do on these experiments. And this is, again, where good science. Reliable, robust, well replicated, lots of decades. The relationship here is at best 0.3. So you know that correlation goes from 0 to 1, where 0 is no correlation and 1 is very strong correlation. 0.3. Intelligence, what this clearly shows, is that intelligence is necessary, but nowhere near sufficient for being rational. Okay. So here's two things that are insufficient for making you rational. Just being very intelligent and just being able to use logic. The science is actually clear on this. So notice how a lot of the ways our culture has tried to understand rationality are now coming into question. Rationality is equivalent, think of Descartes. Now you see why Descartes' wrong, of course, right? Of logicality. Well, that turns out to be false. Oh, well, rationality is the same thing as being really smart, really intelligent, right? Nope, that turns out to be false. Oh, what is that then? What is that then? So now we're starting to do good science, right? We're starting to get away from common sense. We're starting to have some humility. It's now a real problem. Well, what is it? What is it? And it gives us, again, a way of talking about what we've been talking about through here. The very processes that make you intelligent can actually cause you to be irrational. There is no contradiction in saying you're highly intelligent and highly irrational. None at all. So now we have to ask ourselves, well, what's the missing piece? So let's remember that. We've got an important question that we need to ask and answer. What's the missing piece for rationality? What's missing? Something else is going on. And that missing piece is going to tell us quite a bit, I think, about the overlap between wisdom and rationality. Now there's a third argument. And it's an important argument because it's also going to connect to the issue of understanding, which is, again, a crucial feature of wisdom. Now, Stanovich and West talk about this argument, but they don't cite an individual who actually came up with the argument explicitly. I think it's just because I don't think there's any fraud. I think they just didn't read it, because the person I'm going to talk about is Smedslin, and the article is from the Scandinavian Journal of Psychology in 1970. So, it's impossible to read everyone, everywhere, at all times. Again, we are in the finitary predicament. But Smedslin pointed out something that Stanovich and West do take seriously, and because Smedslin makes an explicit and clear argument for it, we should pay attention to what he says. He says, well, there's a difficulty with these. So this is the third response. We've had Cohen, we've had Cherniak, and now a response that I will attribute to Smedslin. Stanovich and West don't, but they should. But again, no crime on their part. Okay. Smedslin says, well, there's a difficulty with interpreting the experiments. Again, that's the issue. Always the issue of interpretation. And you can't do an experiment to decide the interpretation, because then you have to then you have to interpret that experiment. You can't experiment your way out of interpretation. Interpretation is always going to be needed in science, and that means theoretical debate is always going to be needed. Okay, so back to the theoretical debate. Smedslin says, now, interpreting these experiments relies on a distinction between a fallacy and a misunderstanding. Because there's two ways in which I can give the wrong answer. One is I interpret the problem correctly, I understand it, but then I reason incorrectly, and that's why I get the wrong answer. So the fault in a fallacy, fallacious reasoning, is this is where the error comes in, the poor reasoning. I reason incorrectly. But there's another way in which I can give the wrong answer. I could get to the same conclusion, the wrong answer. Well, what is it? I actually reason correctly in a normative fashion, but I've understood the problem incorrectly. Right? And that's a misunderstanding. Somebody misunderstands us, the error comes in because they've interpreted the problem, they've understood the problem incorrectly, but once you give them that, right, incorrect interpretation, there's nothing wrong with their reasoning. There's nothing wrong with their reasoning. Okay, great. So there's two places we can get. There's two equally good explanations for why we produce the wrong answers. One is we reason incorrectly, and that's a fallacy because we've got the correct interpretation. The other one is we are reasoning correctly. There's nothing wrong with our reasoning, but we've understood the problem incorrectly. And that's a misunderstanding, right? And that's, okay, so this distinction is really crucial because, right, this distinction is really crucial. Keeping these apart is really crucial because if we want to conclude that people are irrational, we have to be attributing to them fallacious cognition, not pure, oh wow, where did pure come? Wait, we have to attribute to them fallacious cognition, not some kind of distortion in the communication. Right? That they've misunderstood us. One of the ways in which people typically often avoid self-criticism, avoiding the possibility that they might have reasoned incorrectly, is to always claim that they have merely been misunderstood. Look for that in somebody. Look for somebody who never says, right, my argument is wrong, I did it wrong. Look for somebody who always says, no, I've been misunderstood. Okay, because they're basically trading on this in an equivocal fashion. They're bullshitting you in a way. Okay, so now sometimes they should say I've been misunderstood. Totally. But sometimes they should say I reasoned wrong. Okay, let's get back to this. Okay, so far so good, right? But then Smedlin said, but this is difficult because these things aren't independent the way we need them to be. What I mean, the attribution of fallacy or the attribution of misunderstanding are not independent the way we need them to be in order to cleanly interpret the experimental results as showing that people are largely engaging in fallacious reasoning. Well, why? So Smedlin does something, and of course I think it's preliminary, but we'll have to come back to it, right? Which is give a preliminary account of understanding. And he basically says, well, what is it to understand something? And he says, well, to understand X, we ask people to give us something that's identical to X. Now let's use arrows here. To X. We asked us to give us something that contradicts X. Right? We ask us to give things that X implies. And these are all, of course, related because identity is a kind of implication, contradiction is a failure of implication. And then we also ask them to give us things that are relevant to X. Yeah, there it is again. I would also add, by the way, because when you look at further research and understanding, people talk about it, not only what is relevant to X, but also what is X relevant to. And I don't think Smedlin would object to that. But here's relevance again, of course. Okay, so what's the problem? Now put this one aside, and Smedlin just sort of puts it aside in his argument. And of course, that's something I'm not going to sort of let sit by. He puts aside this. He says, well, ignoring that, look at these three. The way we determine if somebody has understood us is we determine if they have drawn the identities we would draw the contradictions we have drawn the implications we've drawn, right? So somebody understands us if they reason the way that we do. So what Smedlin said, this is what the scientists are assuming. The scientists are assuming that the participants in the experiment have understood the problem. Right? Have understood the problem correctly and then reasoned incorrectly. But notice how this is a pragmatic contradiction. Because if they've understood the problem correctly, then they reason the way the scientist does in this very difficult task of interpreting a problem. But then they reason in the way the scientist does it when they're actually trying to solve the problem. And that's problematic. In fact, couldn't I say this? Couldn't I say the fact that the participants in the experiment are consistently producing the wrong answer is good evidence that they are misunderstanding the problem. People are reliably misunderstanding these problems. Well, that can't be because the scientists made them. What scientists can't be making mistakes. Scientists can't misunderstand community. What are you attributing to scientists? Godlike authority? No, stick with the argument here, right? You can conclude that they're making the fallacy, but it's sort of like you have to say, for some reason, right, at this really difficult problem of interpreting what I'm saying, they're reasoning very correctly, and then when they go to solve the problem, they're reasoning poorly. Or you can say, right, they're reasoning correctly, but they've misunderstood the problem. But that also means that they're reasoning poorly. Or maybe I've misrepresented or miscommunicated the problem. See, now it's much more problematic. Okay, so two things to note here. Two important things to note. First of all, we've got to come back to this because there's an opening here. And Stanovich and West, because they haven't read Smedlin and because they don't have this so clearly explicated, they can't sort of pick up on that. So I'm not criticizing them for not seeing this, right? But they do come up with a very important point. And this is convergent with their argument against Cohen. They argue for this. They argue, in order to break this impasse, we need a normativity on construal. We need a normativity on how people interpret, make sense of, size up the situation of the problem. That's what construal means. Basically, we need a normativity on how they formulate the problem. And this has to be an independent normativity. Independent of what? Independent of inferential norms. Right? If I try to use inference as my good inference as my standard for doing this, I'll fall into this circle. I have to be able to evaluate construal independently of evaluating how people make inferences. That's the only way I'm going to break out of this. But that's okay because that means, Stanovich doesn't take this as deeply as he should, but that means that there's a non-inferential aspect to rationality that is central. There's an aspect of rationality that has to do with understanding, with construal, that is non-inferential in nature. And that, of course, points back to this, because relevance is pre-inferential. The way you formulate your problems, remember that, has to do with relevance realization, and that is something that is pre-inferential in nature. So we can actually put this together very cleanly, I would argue. We can say, now, see, what Stanovich and West say is, okay, we need this normativity of construal. It has to be independent of our inferential normativity. And then they go, we don't know what this is. What could it be? What that normativity of construal would look like? It's, right. And it's like, granted. But here's a proposal, right? I think it's a proposal that sort of is clearly, right, presented to us from a lot of the arguments we've already considered, right? We do have a normativity on construal. We have standards of what a good problem formulation is versus a bad problem formulation. Where do we study that normativity in psychology? Well, we study it in insight problem solving. We know, right, what a bad problem formulation is. A bad problem formulation is one that puts you into a combinatorially explosive search space. A bad problem formulation is one that does not turn your ill-defined problem into a well-defined problem. A bad problem formulation is one in which you are not paying careful attention to how salience is misleading you. So that's telling us something really interesting, right? That there is, in addition to inference being crucial to being rational, insight is crucial to being rational too, because if what we mean by insight is somebody who is good at formulating problems, avoiding combinatorial explosion, avoiding ill-definedness, avoiding salience misdirection, right? Then being insightful is going to be central to being rational. It's not going to be something that comes up out of the irrational aspects of the psyche. It comes in from the non-inferential. But why should we be identifying, nobody is here, identifying rationality with just a pure logical normativity on inference? So what I propose to you is that we need to understand the role of both insight and inference in rationality. And that's much more problematic. But we need that, because we need to integrate rationality and understanding together in an integrated account. And notice how now more and more rationality and wisdom are starting to overlap for us in a serious way. Because if I now get rationality and understanding, inference and insight enmeshed together, then, of course, I'm starting to talk more and more, and having to happen in a systematic and reliable way. I'm starting to talk more and more about the ways when we talk about how people are wise.
Let's go ahead and take a quick break here, guys, just to cover what he just went over before he gets to his concluding statements here, because he gave us a lot there. So we're back to how the experimenters were using a very narrow pointed methodology, and we want to know when, where, and to what degree we should be using formal logic when we're trying to understand these experiments that claim that humans are irrational. Because we're finding it's not about, was it Cohen? Stanovic that thought it's not about rationality, it's actually about intelligence. You know, he ends up being wrong, but it gets us somewhere. There's a deep difference between rationality and intelligence.
So real quick,
we can recognize like how foolishness is highly intellectual but poorly rational.
So that's what foolishness is you're intelligent but you're not rational.
But you're not being rational. Yeah, you're not being particularly insightful, in fact. So when we test people's ability to utilize good rationalization, how do they deal with the computational limitations, or what is their capacity to do good relevance realization?
Yeah, so if G is equal to GR, which is general factor of reasoning.
So intelligence versus general reasoning. there should be a strong relation between intelligence and how well someone performs in the experiments. But
it's only a
there's
0.3
not.
correlation, which
That's
is very
right.
low.
Very low.
You
So
know, if it-
intelligence is necessary, but not entirely sufficient to explain what good rationality is. So now we revisit Descartes, who thought rationality is logicality, and we find Descartes was in fact wrong. But neither is it intelligence, as Stanovich
So
is trying to suggest.
what is
So what is
rationality?
it?
Yeah.
What's the missing piece? Because the very processes that make us intellectual don't make us fully rational. So the third response comes from a gentleman named Smedlin, that this is who Vervaeke attributes it to in 1970, who noted that the difficulty interpreting these events, and suggested that we can't interpret an experiment that is designed to interpret. You can't experiment your way out of interpretations.
Yeah.
So we have a fallacy and a misunderstanding to correct for here, because there's two ways that we can give wrong answers. One is that I understand, but then I reason incorrectly. The second is that I reason correctly, but I misunderstood the problem. So I noticed here at this point that rationality is kind of a valuing system that we're performing in relation with the world. Thank you. And irrationality would be a fallacious cognition, but not a distortion in communication or misunderstanding necessarily.
Well,
So someone's making fallacious
the assumption
intentions.
the assumption of the irrationality of humans assumes a fallacy and not a misunderstanding.
That's right.
So it's yes, the people understood the task correctly, but they reasoned incorrectly, and that may not necessarily be the case.
That's right. That's right.
So but fallacy and misunderstanding are not independent from each other.
Yeah, they're not as independent
As
as
we need them to be,
Yeah, to be
yeah.
able to do good science here. So we start to look at how do people understand something.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, say understanding an apple. Give us something that is, the same as the apple. So, multiple kinds of apple, Granny
Or they
Smith.
can give us another kind
Or
of fruit.
another
that's
fruit.
Similar. Yeah.
Give us a way that they're different. Okay,
Give us
a
something that
rock.
contradicts it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
give us something that implies apple. Tree creates apple.
There you go.
Implies the
Yeah.
apple.
Or the word apple.
Or apple. And then there's
What's
what it's
something
relevant to. But Smesland only was really looking at this X same, X different, X implies.
Yeah,
and
they said, well,
ignores-
let's leave the relevant thing out because we don't know how to solve for that one.
Yeah.
But we're going to focus on identity, contradiction, and implication. And we notice that in this case, scientists are assuming participants have understood the problem correctly and reasoned correctly as a result. But how could they be doing that? The fact that the participants are consistently giving us the wrong answer actually seems that they've largely misunderstood the problem. So,
Well, it seems like it's both. Like
it seems like it's
they're
both.
they're both misunderstanding the problem
And
but reasoning right,
incorrect, yeah.
and also reasoning incorrectly.
Yeah. But how can you understand with how can you reason without understanding,
Yeah.
and back and forth? So how can you reason incorrectly but also misunderstand correctly, or understand correctly and reason correctly? It doesn't make sense. So it seems like it's a both and kind of thing. It's part of an opponent processing in our cognition. It's a calibration process. And relevance realization is key for us to understand how rationality works now. So this is where Vervaeke's work really comes to the fore. We need a normativity on how people formulate or construe, make sense of a problem. Now, we need a way that is independent of the inferential norms.
Got everything out there.
So there's an aspect of rationality that is non-inferential, that we've never recognized before. And so now we're recognizing relevance then as pre-inferential in nature, just like insight is to relevance realization. So the proposal here, we do have a normativity on how we construe things, what good problem formulation versus bad problem formulation is. We study this in insight problem solving. So in addition to inference being essential, insight, we notice, is also essential. So we need inference and insight to perform good rationalization. We need both insight and inference, that is.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, about where he left us off. Was there anything else he had there?
Nope.
Right on. All right, so I'm going to give him a quick little bit of a rewind here. I'm going to jump back in.
Inference and insight enmesh together.
All right.
Then, of course, I'm starting to talk more and more, and having to happen in a systematic and reliable way. I'm starting to talk more and more about the ways when we talk about how people are wise. If we give up thinking of rationality as being like Mr. Spock or Mr. Data, and we give up, the idea that being rational is just being really smart, then we start to get into the problematic notion of rationality, and we need the idea of multiple competencies. We need the distinction between being logical and being rational, being intelligent and being rational, and we have to understand that there's an important component of rationality that is non-inferential in nature. It has to do with a normativity on construal, the generation of insight, not a normativity of argumentation and the generation of inference. Right? And that's important. That's really important. So, the issue of construal is acknowledged but not in any way resolved by Stanovich. So, it's not going to play, although it should, given his own arguments, it's not going to play a significant role in his theory of rationality. What is that theory? What does it look like? What is the missing piece according to Stanovich? So we said, right, that intelligence is not predictive or only weakly predictive of, right, rationality. These are not equivalent. And along the way, we got yet another argument for intelligence being relevance realization. Okay, that's all good. What is the missing piece then? The relationship here is only 0.3. What accounts for most of the variance then, as a scientist would say? So Stanovich argues very clearly for what he calls a cognitive style. This term is a bit equivocal. It's used in slightly different ways in psychology for different things. And he also invokes the notion of bad mindware, inappropriate psychotech. So that's also in there. So there's sort of cognitive styles and psychotech that can both be part of the missing variance. So one part here is the psychotech you're using, right? You can have poor, what he calls mindware, which is like software. He's picking up on the psychotech idea here. All right, and then the other, and this is what often gets given more priority because it accounts for a lot, is an appropriate cognitive style. The difference between these are not as clear, I think, as Stanovich seems to think they are. So we'll have to come back to that when we come back to the relationship between psychotechnology and wisdom. So what's the cognitive style? So a cognitive style is is something you can learn, at least as Stanovich is using it, and it's to learn a set of sensitivities and skills. Notice the procedurality and the perspectival in here, but it's implicit. It's in the background, right? But what is the cognitive style that's most predictive of doing well on the reasoning tests? He gets this from Jonathan Barron. This is the notion of active open-mindedness. And when you see this, you're going to see a lot of Stoicism here. And this overlaps a lot with the cognitive behavioral therapy that is derived from Stoicism. And again, that's convergent. That's not by design or deliberate, and that tells you something. Something crucial is being seen here. What is active open-mindedness? So active open-mindedness is to train yourself to look for these patterns of self-deception, to look for biases. Okay? So here's a bias you've heard me mention. You've heard me mention some of these, the confirmation bias, or the essentialism bias, right? Or the representationalism, or the availability, misusing the availability heuristic. Notice that a bias is just a heuristic misused. We've talked about this. So this is, I tend to only look for information that confirms my beliefs, right? This is, I tend to treat any category as pointing to an essence shared by all the members. And maybe we should give up an essentialism of sacredness, or at least in the terms of its content. I've already suggested that to you. The availability heuristic is, the availability bias is, I judge something's probability by how easily I can remember it or imagine it happening. We've talked about all of these. There's many of these. So what do I do? First of all, I have to do the science. I learn about all of these, right? So this comes from Barron. I want to point out something that Stanovich doesn't say as clearly as Barron does. So what I do is I learn about these, and I sensitize myself. I sensitize myself, and this is like a virtue, because I have to care about the process, not just the results. I sensitize myself to looking for these biases in my day-to-day cognition. And then I actively counteract them. I actively say, no, I'm doing confirmation bias. I need to look for potential information that will disconfirm it. And here's where you can now begin to also give up the individualistic assumption of competence. Part of the way in which I can be rationally competent is I can ask you to help me overcome my confirmation bias, because it's very hard for me to look for information that disconfirms my beliefs. It's much easier for you. And then if I practice with you enough, I can start to internalize you, and I can start to get better at looking for my own instances where I fall prey to the confirmation bias. So I now actively counteract those. That's sort of where Stanovich leaves it. Barron points out, right, but you don't overdo this. Because if you overdo this, you will start to choke on the tsunami of combinatorial explosion that it will overwhelm you. So again, you have to do this, and you have to do this to the right degree. And that becomes much more nebulous. And again, we're starting to shade over into wisdom, right? So what you should then ask is, what predicts, if being intelligent doesn't predict, right? If intelligence predicted rationality, then being intelligent would predict how well you've cultivated active open-mindedness, but of course it doesn't. So what is it about people that predicts how well they will cultivate active open-mindedness? And this is the degree to which people have a need for cognition. This is people who problematize things. They create problems, they look for problems, they go out and on their own try to learn. I would add to that, there's two aspects to need for cognition. There's a curiosity in which I need to have more information so that I can manipulate things more effectively, and that's important. People that are, in that sense, more curious and want to solve problems, not just gather facts, but solve problems, because that's what needs for cognition points to. That's important, but also think about how important wonder is. Right? How much it opens you up to putting into question your entire worldview, your deeper sense of identity, deep need for cognition. And that's relevant to do because rationality is ultimately an existential issue, not just a theoretical, inferential, logical issue. So what we're going to need to do is to come back and look more at Stanovich's account of rationality, some criticisms of it, and then on the basis of that, because we've already overlapping with it so much, take a look at some of the key theories of the nature of wisdom and try to draw that together into a viable account of wisdom, which we can then integrate with the account of enlightenment. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Man. Meow, 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 meow. Ruff, ruff, ruff. Ruff, ruff, ruff. Ruff, ruff, ruff. Ruff, ruff.
Insight, not inference.
Yeah, guys, that was a great episode. Okay, I'm glad that he went further into rationality. So the ways people are wise are going to be something that we want to study if we want to become more rational. Because rationality isn't just about being really intelligent or really smart like Spock or anything like that. It's actually a domain of multiple competencies, a normativity of insight. And we know intelligence is only weakly predictive of rationality. So what accounts for most of the variance? Because we only had a 0.3 correlation between the two. So we're looking for what fills up the rest of that space, that 0.7.
So there's an issue with our software, our psychotech, but there's also inappropriate cognitive style. So we're introduced to the idea of cognitive style. So what is cognitive style? It's the development of, or it's certain sensitivities and skills
That you can actually learn.
Yeah, and then
such as active open-mindedness.
Yeah, so what is the style that most predictive of success? And this is active open-mindedness.
Yeah, success and rationality, that is. Yeah,
so basically training yourself to look for the patterns of self-deception, so biases or misused heuristics.
That's right. Because we have confirmation biases, essentialism biases, and availability heuristics or availability biases that we use. And a bias is basically a heuristic that is being misused.
Sure.
So the confirmation bias is when one tends to look for info that confirms the already preferred held belief.
And that's the personal bias.
Yes,
and
personal bias. You want to believe this is true, so you're going to try and find things that confirm it's true rather than things that disprove it.
And then the next one was
essentialism.
Yeah, which you could say is like, well, how to best describe this without using the word essential? I would see that one as like you could say like an appeal to authority would be an essentialist bias. Like this person should know that this is, so that's a group thing. You got the personal bias, you got the group bias, and then the third bias is
many people say it's true, so you believe it. Then the availability bias, which is a heuristic that we use. That's similar to the essentialism bias, isn't it? I didn't catch the essentialism bias when he stated it.
We should look them up next time. But basically, it's we're not really going into the different biases, but we need to learn about these fallacies and biases. Let's see, too. So we need to look at these fallacies and biases, and then.
Okay, really, you're right about that on essentialism bias. It's the belief that members of the same group are fundamentally alike. It plays a role in social stereotypes, can lead to harm.
Yeah. So that's, groups of people opposed to an individual. But ideally with active open-mindedness, we should be looking for these biases in ourselves in our day-to-day cognition.
Yes.
And actively counteract them.
Yes.
And then practice this with others too.
Yes, because we don't want to overdo it. There's combinatorial explosion on the amount of different things that you could be biased on. So we want to do it to the right degree. So again, it's the tuning of relevance realization.
Well, like
wisdom is what helps us
practicing it with
here.
Another person. You want to keep doing it because then you're just ripping each other down. Which is like
but it's good. It's still good, and then you can internalize that person when you're on your own and figure out what would they think about this. How would they challenge this?
But optimize.
We're finding a way to optimize
or
it.
minimize.
That's
but
right.
Optimize.
But optimize.
Optimize the practice.
So what predicts active open-mindedness? To what degree? And we find it's actually to what degree one is willing to learn, and that comes down to our curiosity, which is our wants to have more info, but it's not just to have more info, just to gather facts. It's you want to have more info because you're trying to solve problems. So it's curiosity aimed in that direction, and then a sense of wonder,
Yeah.
which opens you up to your relation with reality and the cosmos. So there's that very deeply existential mode that we can also open up through
Yeah.
to access our wisdom, to be more rational, to be
Right.
more insightful.
Yeah, and so it's problematize is the word he used, and it's not the sense of make a problem out of something, like make an issue. It's the taking of data and information and placing it out, so then you can work through it. And then if you combined this wonder and awe of it, like, somebody who really freaking loves math, that is working to create new maths for new things. They're creating a problem of it. They have so much information, they're laying it all out, they're really trying to figure it out, they're trying to solve for
They're
some
curious.
unknown thing, and they're just like,
They're really in a state of wonder because,
Yeah.
and they're just totally open to whatever new information could come in. That's it, man.
so
That's so cool that they
stay
drilled it down.
curious and stay wonderful.
They got it down to such a degree that they recognize that both Stoicism and ancient Greek philosophical way of living actually comes into congruence with modern cognitive behavioral theory, or cognitive behavioral therapy. In fact, the practice of Stoicism and the practice of cognitive behavioral therapy have a lot of convergence.
Yeah.
Very cool.
Yeah.
That was an awesome episode. That makes so much sense, and now I see why we have such an issue understanding how to be rational nowadays, because we don't even understand what rationality is. We're just now piecing it together, and thanks to Vervaeke, standing on the shoulders of those that came before him, he's, I think, adding the essential piece of relevance realization into how we come to
Yeah.
our understanding of what rationality actually is. This will help us become more rational in our scientific endeavors as well as our spiritual endeavors. We can be more fair and open-minded of other people's beliefs because we're not so closed off and certain. We're in a sense of open wonder together for the sacred. And we can be in wonder for how all these different variant beliefs and all these different cultures came to some fundamental similar truths. How they're all pointing at essential things like agape, like unconditional
Yeah,
love.
or even what they're actually all pointing to, like even before the how they came to this, but just like what are they pointing to? Let's reason this out.
Because there's a lot of good angles here that we can work with.
Like comparing, say like Christian scripture with, Hebrew, the Old Testament, but in Hebrew, and comparing it to the Quran, and comparing it to Buddhism, and comparing it to like, and actually getting together and then actively poking holes in where there's holes should be poked, but then also finding what the core nuggets that are holding it together. Because fundamentally, regardless of what God you worship or how you worship it, or whether you worship or not, all humans are the same, are still trying to do the same thing.
We're still trying to develop wisdom so that we can
Yeah.
be in more optimal relation
Yeah.
with our environment. So we realize that wisdom is absolutely integral to that optimization process, that we can't just be intelligent beings. We need the wisdom to be able to properly, responsibly wield that intelligence. And that is the thing that we seem to be sorely missing nowadays, as we have these incredibly powerful weapons and ways of destroying one another, yet we have not the wisdom and how to
We've been rather foolish.
utilize them.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah. Well, that's all I got on that. And
I couldn't agree more. Though. Yeah, same here. That sums up this episode, guys. And we've run about 2 hours here tonight. I think that's a good time for us. You guys can catch up on previous episodes if you're behind or you're just running into the show for the first time. But we highly encourage you, if you're enjoying our Meaning Making 101 series, to explore more of John Vervaeke's work. You can check out his channel. You can see the entire Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series there, as well as the follow-up series to that, After Socrates. How can we actually actuate this wisdom that he has now told us about? And you can also check out his Dialogos conversations and many interviews and other conversations he's had on his channel. He actually even teaches mindfulness practice on his channel. So there's a lot of good stuff there for you guys. And, make sure to give him some love. Hit him with some likes and a subscribe and comment on his videos to help the
Doesn't
algorithm
he have
out.
some type of like whatever foundation for research in the
He actually
continuance
does
of
have
that
the
stuff,
Vervaeke
so-
Foundation now, and you can contribute to that through his Patreon and get a lot more
So
as
that
well.
that'd be what, like say if you don't got the time, but you still really like what he's doing, pitch him a $5
Yeah,
or something
yeah.
like that.
Go onto the
if that's
Patreon and check out what he's got going on there. And we would greatly appreciate you guys doing the same for us. If you're enjoying what we're doing here on Meaning Making 101, make sure to smash that like and subscribe. Throw a comment down. It helps the algorithm and helps us reach more people. This series is also on Spotify and Apple and all of the major podcast platforms, so you can find Actuali everywhere that is convenient for you. And go on and hit us with a rating on Spotify and on Apple. That helps us a lot as well. We got a lot more on the podcast side of things, where there's guided meditations, guided Wim Hof breathing sessions, and so much more. So I invite you guys to journey through the previous episodes and to continue journeying with us. We are down to episode 42 coming up now, so we've only got 8 more episodes left.
Oh man, yeah. So that's 2 months.
Yeah.
Hey, we're finally there.
We're almost there.
Remember last year we were like, yeah, we could do it in a year and
We
a half.
started it around fall, and then we did have to miss a few episodes here and there, so we are going to probably be finishing around winter time towards the end of fall. But that's great, man. We did it. It took him a year to put out this series. It's taken us just about around the same time to do our own review of it. And guys, we're not the great teachers here. Vervaeke is a great teacher, and we are inviting you guys just to learn along with us. How can we make more meaning in this world today? Because we are the meaning makers.
Yeah, and we are the somewhat adequate pupils.
as best as we can be. I hope maybe we're a good representation of the common people out there, because Vervaeke is, he's coming at us with a lot of high-minded stuff, and it's hard to understand just dropping right into like episode 40 of this series. But if you actually start from the very beginning, you'll find it quite fascinating. It's a journey through ancient history. Even in the first episode, he goes deep into ancient history, and he talks about our modern fascination with zombies, and he ties it all together. It's so cool what he's doing, and he really is helping us awaken from the meaning crisis. And I'm very grateful for this work that he's been doing on behalf of humanity, out and just putting it out there for free. It's really an amazing work. So thank you, Vervaeke. And thank you all for joining us. I've been Chris.
I've been DJ.
We love you guys. We'll see you soon. Oh, yeah. And join us next week. We might actually start a little bit earlier, and I'll have to put a post down about that. Maybe 7 o'clock. We'll discuss.
6 or 7.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
That way we can, get to bed early enough.
Yeah, true that. And I think we might actually get more viewers on the live stream. I mean, we're still a small channel here on YouTube, and most of our listens happen after the fact, especially on the podcast side of things. But maybe if we push it a little bit earlier and more of you guys are hearing about us and letting your friends and family know, then we can get this thing to grow, because meaning making has just begun, and we invite you guys to continue journeying with us. So thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Actuali Podcast. See you next time.